We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ariana King. I am the marketing coordinator here at Meetup. These are some guidelines for today's event. The event will be recorded. However, you won't appear in the video as everyone's video is muted. In addition, your audio will be muted during the event. We welcome questions for our panelists. You can go ahead and submit those in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Closed captioning is available. To turn it on, click on the live transcription icon at the bottom of your screen and select your preferences. So let's meet our panelists for today's event. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Janice Gassam Asare. You can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited for this conversation. As Ariana said, my name is Dr. Janice Gassam Asare. I am a DEI consultant. I work with organizations and institutions to create more equity in the workplace. So I focus on consulting and doing equity audits and trying to create a more inclusive workplace. I'm also an author. I've written 2 books, Dirty Diversity and The Pink Elephant, which focus on diversity and racial equity in the workplace. I'm a professor of management, and I'm also a senior contributing writer for Forbes, and I write about topics around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you so much, Janice. We also have with us today, Johnny Bailey. Johnny, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johnny Bailey. I am the founder of the ShineHard Foundation, which is a DC-based nonprofit with a mission to close the racial wealth gap. We provide courses and a membership community to help Black Americans discover the wealth that they already possess. I'm also a digital coach for Google, where we're providing free trainings for Black and Latinx entrepreneurs to bridge the digital divide and accelerate these local economies in major markets in America. Also, I'm the CEO of Bailey Media Group, which is a marketing and branding consulting agency focusing on helping small businesses grow and multicultural campaigns with big brands. So happy to be here to have this conversation.
And I'm happy to have you guys here with us today. So for today's event, we will be having a conversation about myths and misconceptions within the Black community, and our panelists will be helping clear those things up for us. So it'll be a 40-minute conversation, and it'll be followed with a 15-minute Q&A. Again, please do leave those questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the first misconception, and that is that, quote, Black people always make everything about race. And I think that's an interesting conversation to be having now as we sit here and talk about race. Johnny, do you want to share your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, well, from my experience, this question can be used as a deflection or protection of the status quo. Fundamentally, I think it's about denial. Because if we say injustice or socioeconomic outcomes are impacted by race, then subsequently other American myths or beliefs come into question, right? So we have to be a little bit more open-minded around that. The historical logic goes that if we can find one thing that's not about race, then the whole formula is false. And on the contrary, I think it's better stated that in the United States, race and racism has impacted almost every aspect of public life. Since the Civil War, we can look at Black codes, Jim Crow laws, redlining, wage gaps. And as a Black American who knows a little bit about history, I kind of pose that same question right back and say, why is everything about race?
Yeah, to piggyback off of what Johnny was sharing, I think everything is about race because race is inextricably linked to every system. Racism is linked to every system within this country. So to say, why do you have to make it about race, or why does everything have to be about race, which is something that I've heard often, I think is like misguided. And points to perhaps a lack of understanding of how race and racism is entrenched in the systems within this country, as Johnny shared. So I think it feels a little bit like racial gaslighting, which may be a term some people are not familiar with, but racial gaslighting is just when someone shares an experience that they have with racism, people invalidating that experience and saying, are you sure it was because of race? Or are you sure it was because you are XYZ race? And so that's gaslighting behavior. And I think if we're trying to open ourselves up to having more conversations about race and racism and how to resolve the issues and systemic inequities within this country, we have to be sort of open to having these conversations, even if we don't see or understand how race and racism is sort of entrenched in all of our systems.
So I think that coming off of these statements where everything is about race and it's so important and entrenched to everything, where some people feel like we're only our race and some people feel like we need to identify our race. The next myth that we're going to talk about is whether or not color blindness is the goal.
I'll jump in and say, you know, one of the, I just did a workshop about microaggressions before this session. And, you know, one of the things that someone said on the session was, well, I was raised not to see color. And that's something that I hear often, we all hear often, maybe some of us on this call or on this session have said that before. But I always say the goal is not to see color. That's part of the reason why I titled my book, The Pink Elephant, because I always say race is like the pink elephant in the workplace. Imagine how difficult it is to see a pink elephant coming in and pretend that you don't see it. We also see race. If you have eyes to see, we see race, but the purpose is not to not see race, but it's not to judge people based on their race and to make decisions solely based off of that. So I think we have to move away from this like color blindness and understand that that's not the goal. And I heard someone say the quote that I thought was very profound. And they said, if you don't see race, how will you see racism? So I thought that that was a really, really profound sort of saying, but I think it's an understanding that the goal is not to be colorblind, but rather not to make decisions based on a person's skin color.
I think that is so key. Johnny, what were you going to say on that myth?
I agree. I think that the I don't see color ideology can be hurtful and offensive to people who've had very real experiences with racism or race in the workplace or in society. Historically, you know, the idea that Americans or justice doesn't see color dates back to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, where that case allowed racial segregation in public facilities. And since that point, it's kind of been an acceptable language or an immunity to say, hey, I don't see color. You know, I was raised not to see color. I heard Joe Biden say that sometimes. And I think that there's people who say that who don't mean harm. They don't necessarily understand the complexities of what that means to people of color. But professionally and personally, when we're having conversations at Google in our employee resource group, you know, I hear people say, you know, we want people to see our color. We want people to see the benefit of diversity and the talent and the culture that we bring to the table. Color blindness it feels more like ignoring racism and not solving it.
Yeah, that's very true. And Johnny, in that last statement, you started reaching back a little bit, talking about Plessy v. Ferguson. And for our next myth, I want to go a little bit further back and let's talk about the myth that slavery is a product of capitalism. Could you expound on that and give us more information on where this comes from and if it's true?
Yeah, I think I can get very historical. I think I'll probably bring some of the nerdy historical dates to this conversation. But slavery as a practice is said to be older than the first human records, which dates back to like 300 BC. However, chattel slavery in the Western world is, in fact, a product of capitalism. And so here's like a quick history lesson is during the 15th century, Europe was governed by an aristocracy, right? Where people were born into a class and there was little to no upward mobility. Now, during this time, this new economic system was going where they were going away from land and they were actually moving more towards capital and commercialism, which really only exacerbated the inequality amongst the classes. So as population increased in Europe during this time, the underclass, aka the colonists, left Europe for the new land. Upon discovering the new land, they needed labor to cultivate that new land, thus their participation in the transatlantic slave trade in the 17th and 18th century. So now two important dates, 1691 said slaveholders determined that slavery would be determined by skin color, which means black equals slave. Then 100 years later, 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And for Southern states, this became the economic engine for the burgeoning nation. And what was their fuel of choice for this engine? Human slavery. So the moral of the story here, you say get to the point, is that an astronomical amount of wealth was created from and inherited on the backs of free labor from this economic system. So slavery is a part of capitalism and probably one of the ugly truths that some people don't know or want to accept, but there it is.
Yeah, and to just like not really expound on it, because I feel like, Johnny, you broke that down perfectly. But I think when I think recently the reparations conversation has come up. And I wrote an article about reparations, and people were sending me emails about how that would work. And they didn't understand why people who currently are living, who did not sort of like individually contribute to chattel slavery, should be paying reparations for descendants of enslaved people. And exactly as you explained, Johnny, I know that there's ways to calculate the amount of capital that was made on the backs of Black Americans in this country who built this country. So I think that when we have a conversation about when we start to talk about reparations and what that would look like, there's actually people who've sat and tried to figure out and calculate the trillions of dollars that would be owed to Black Americans for that labor, for that unpaid labor that took place. So I just wanted to add that on.
Yeah, Dr. Janice, thank you. You brought that to the present, and I think we can jump right into our next myth. And we've established that this one is clearly not true based on the information you all have shared so far. But this myth is slavery no longer impacts the lives of Black people in America. Can you start sharing more information on the connections between the experiences that our Black ancestors had and those of us today?
Absolutely. So one book I would recommend, I might be recommending books throughout this whole session. One of the most impactful books that I've ever read, I talked about this book in my first book, Dirty Diversity, but in 2016, I read the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. And in that book, she talked about this idea of generational trauma. And just to give a little bit of background, my parents immigrated to the US, so I'm not a descendant of enslaved people. So this idea of generational trauma was not something I fully understood. But in reading this book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, she talked about how, this psychological sort of idea that people can pass on the pain and harm and trauma that they experience down to generation to generation to generation. So and that could impact things like a person's mindset, and their belief system, and, things that we don't really fully think about and understand and contextualize. So I think that when we have conversations about, slavery, a lot of people, say, well, no one is a slave anymore and slavery is over. I think another misconception that we didn't really add to the list, but that people have, is that in 1865, when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, that's when Black people became free. But as we know, 1863, when he signed it, Black people became free. But as we know, that wasn't actually the case. So I think there's so many ways that slavery has impacted Black people. And one of which, I think from a financial standpoint, is like our ability to accumulate wealth. And so Black people within this country, many Black people who were living in this country for hundreds of years were not able to own property. And what is the fastest way to build wealth? We should all know is owning property. Well, if Black people have been systemically disadvantaged and systematically disadvantaged for hundreds of years and were not able to own property, how does that widen, or how has that widened the racial wealth gap? So I think all of these things have contributed to the inequality within this country. And we don't, even though these things aren't still taking place in like a sort of like the way that we conceptualize it, as in like Black people picking cotton, those types of things aren't taking place, but there's so many ways that the system still impacts Black people. And I think Johnny mentioned redlining. There's still legal redlining and things that take place where someone might get their home appraised. And as a Black person getting your home appraised, there's tons of people who share stories that their home appraised for $500,000 less than their white counterparts. So all of these things are still like legal sort of racism that takes place within our country. So to say that slavery no longer impacts the lives of Black people is just a fallacy.
Johnny, what are your thoughts on this? Does slavery still impact Black people at all, even a little bit?
I'm just processing what Dr. Janice said, because that was spot on. And so much of the research that we do at ShineHard is really trying to get to the root of the wealth gap and trying to determine where it started, what factors impacted it, and how we can alleviate that pain in America today, especially for Black Americans and African Americans. But I think Dr. Janice really touched on the wealth aspect of it. But I think there's also something else that was stripped away from us during that time. It was our lineage, our names, our culture, the roots to our family tree were really stripped away. And at ShineHard, one of our modules is about history and heritage, and we help Black Americans research their genealogy and build their family tree from scratch. I've done this work personally, and it's crazy. I discovered that my second great grandfather was an enslaved man in Maryland, and he bought his freedom for $1,000 at age 21. Then he went on to own several farms and had several mortgages, and he died with a net worth of $50,000. So he 50x'd his net worth. And for me as an entrepreneur, that's incredibly inspiring and empowering to know that type of resilience is in my bloodline. It gave me a sense of purpose, sense of belonging and identity, even in the present day. And when I did that work, I realized how important and integral it is to the success and the drive, and as Janice said, the mindset of Black and African American people today is just knowing where we come from. And it breaks my heart to know like so many names were omitted from these censuses, and knowing that our ancestral heritage is a form of wealth. That's something that we're still trying to piece together today. So, slavery definitely still affects us in the present day.
Yeah, and I don't even think some people might realize how lucky you are even to have been able to collect that much specific information about your family. Most of these things were copied down in the bindings of Bibles and one house fire, and everything is erased because there was no other method of tracking. It was all word of mouth and notes and margins. So I think that's super exciting for you. Like, I'm just in awe that you were able to get that much information. It's beautiful.
Me too.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of people who can identify that there have been generational difficulties for Black people, but also have a very cut and dry solution. And that moves us to our next myth. The concept that Black people are lazy and should focus on education, family structure, and home ownership, and that in and of itself would close the wealth gap in America. What are your thoughts on that one, Johnny?
Ha 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 ha. It's funny. That's a myth, a misconception, because there's been research done, decades of reporting from the Federal Reserve System, the US Department of Labor, tons of academic and publications that have done research on this. And the data shows that the wealth gap is a product of centuries of inequality and racism that has grown the wealth gap to be so large that, I mean, it can't necessarily be significantly impacted by any individual achievement or action per se. And so even when we see some equality on socioeconomic levels, like, okay, both of us have a master's degree, or both of us are married, or both of us own a home, there's still disparities relating to income and net worth. And that is inexplicable across the board on all socioeconomic levels. And so it's easy to sustain the status quo, I think, by pointing to one of these factors and dismissing the issue as saying people are lazy. But I think the reality is in this society, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And during this pandemic, I think we can see that that also is true, right? And so I always laugh at a quote from one of my virtual mentors, Dr. Claude Anderson. He says, when America gets a cold, Black people get pneumonia. And that just speaks to the disparities that exist in certain communities here in this country. So I can't sit here and act like I have a solution for the wealth gap. I'm doing the work to try to move the ball forward. But what I can assure you is that Black people are not lazy.
Yeah, I'm gonna go on a limb and agree with you. Dr. Janice, what are your thoughts on this concept that Black people are lazy and if we just do more, things will be better?
Yeah, I think what I find to be so preposterous about that statement is that, you know, it's like if you know the history, as Johnny has shared a little bit of it with us, you know that Black people built this country. If you live in the United States, this country was built on the backs of Black people and enslaved people. So it's just so like preposterous to me, like just the statement itself that Black people could be lazy when they built this country, you know? So it's just, to me, it's just like, it doesn't even make any sense. And I just think about all of the sacrifices that Black Americans who were in this country have made. The reason my parents were able to even immigrate here is because of Black people that were here that fought for my parents' right to immigrate here, and several people who've come into this country. So I think it's just, people who say that don't have an understanding of history, because I think if you have an understanding of history within the US, you would know how much labor was generated for this country, where arguably the US is arguably the richest nation in the world. I know that we have people from all over who are joining this session, but I think that we can all admit that the US has such a huge impact in the world. And the reason that the US is such a superpower is because of the labor, the unpaid labor that was put into this country by Black Americans that were here. So I think it's just like so absurd, and it's just such an absurd sort of statement. And what's interesting is, you know, I think sometimes I have to fact check people and tell them, you know, one of the dog whistles that people have used in the past is saying that, you know, Black women are on welfare. We know this term welfare queens, you know, which was started by the Reagan administration. It was this idea of a Black woman sort of leeching off of the system. But if you look at the research, there's actually more white people who are on sort of public assistance programs than there are Black folks. So I think that, like, some people just don't have an understanding of the stats, and also don't have an understanding of the history. But I just think it's so just, it's not a statement based on reality to say Black people are lazy. If you know the history of the country, you know that this country is what it is because of Black people.
And I would say it's easy for people to succumb to the stereotypes because the mass media has created multiple propaganda campaigns. And I think Black people are probably the greatest victim of propaganda in this country. And so if you don't know your history, if you haven't taken the time to do the research, it's easy to just consume what's being put out on the news, on Fox News, CNN, whatever news you watch. You can consume information and assume that this is the reality for said group. But as Janice said, if you really do your research, look into the history books. Google is your friend. There's a lot of information that is available to everyone in this very moment that we can actually uncover and debunk a lot of these myths and stereotypes that, quite frankly, Black people have been the victim of. So, yeah, I think that's just ridiculous to think that.
Yeah, and it's hard when there are people who genuinely just don't have the understanding or haven't gone to look for information that would clarify why these sorts of concepts are false, or even the concept that, you know, the people in their circle are exceptions to these concepts. If they would just, you know, accept the reality around them, it would be easier to let go of a lot of these misconceptions, frankly. In the vein of talking about solutions, obviously just working harder and more education is not going to be the solution for closing the wealth gap. And I want to talk about this concept that demanding reparations for descendants of enslaved people is asking for a government handout. Dr. Janice, you mentioned reparations earlier, and I was wondering if you could explain to us a little bit more about what this concept of reparations are, how people are attempting to calculate them, and why this discussion is even happening.
Yeah, I think that it's an important conversation that's been happening, and I think just based on, you know, all of the history that Johnny has laid out so eloquently, it's so important to sort of, I think if the U.S. as a nation is ever going to heal from the gross atrocities of the past, there has to be some sort of acknowledgement of the wrongdoing that was done to Black Americans in this country. And I don't think that there has been fully an acknowledgement. I know that when Obama was president, there was some sort of apology that was given. But you know, it took that long for any sort of apology to even be made. And if you look back in history, again, this is why I wasn't a history person in high school, but I think as I've gotten older, I've been more interested in learning history. And if you look at even the Kingdom of Hawaii, when Hawaii was invaded, land was seized from the indigenous Hawaiian people, reparations were given to the Hawaiian people, where they received, you can petition to get your land back in Hawaii and to get reparations in the form of land. As we all know, after World War II, when Japanese people were in internment camps, the US government recognized, hey, we committed a wrongdoing. We have to rectify it. There's no way to rectify what we did, but the best way that we can think of is giving $20,000 to the victims of these internment camps. So there have been, you know, in South Africa, they did something similar. The German government has done something similar to Holocaust victims. So we've seen these sorts of reparations being given. It's not like a concept that is like so outside of the reality. And I think it's hard for people to conceptualize what reparations will even look like. And I think that there are several ways that sort of ways that reparations could be given. I know Georgetown is one university that has started to look at reparations. Georgetown was built, the university was built by slaves and by enslaved people, excuse me. And so Georgetown, I think, has started to look into offering free tuition for people who are descendants of the enslaved people that built the university. So for me, I think universities should be offering free tuition for anyone who is a descendant of an enslaved person. I also think it should be debt sort of forgiveness, because you know, there's a lot of research that looks at Black millennials specifically and how we lag behind when it comes to home ownership. And as we've talked about, the best way to accumulate wealth is by owning property. Well, if a majority of Black millennials are saddled with student loan debt, we're not able to pay our six-figure student loan debt and own a home. And that just widens the wealth gap that we've been talking about, the racial wealth gap. So I think that like reparations could come in the form of loan repayments. And then just to get a little bit historical, you know, some of you may be familiar with this idea of 40 acres and a mule. Black people, enslaved people were promised 40 acres of land, and that was never given to them, you know, by Richard T. Sherman after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. That never happened. So the land that was promised to Black people, they never received. So I think that reparations should come in the form of debt repayment, free college tuition for descendants of enslaved people, and land allotments, because at the very least, land was promised to enslaved people and it was never given to them. So I know that that's kind of a little bit long-winded, but just I feel like reparations could come in those three forms.
That was long-winded, but exceptionally clear. Any question you might have had about how reparations could work are definitely answered. Johnny, I know you are big on the history. What are your thoughts on reparations, looking at the experiences of enslaved people, the records that exist based on those instances, and unmet promises, and the conversation around reparations in general?
Yeah, I'm glad that Dr. Janice brought up those examples of Hawaii and of World War II, and then also of Black enslaved, or the descendants, or the enslaved people of the Reconstruction era, because the story goes 40 acres and a mule, and we hear that thrown around in the modern day, but the story is that when the slaves were freed, there was a Freedmen's Bureau that was created, and they decided that a way to repair that would be to offer land in the South that had been either claimed or seized throughout the Civil War. And there was a period of time where these formerly enslaved people actually had this land. Yeah, they had to figure out how to cultivate it themselves, but they were beginning to start anew with this land. It wasn't long before Andrew Johnson became president and repealed all of those policies and promises. And those formerly enslaved people had to go back to either working for their former masters or displaced to find work elsewhere. So that was about the closest point we got to actually having some reparations. But imagine had my descendants been able to actually have that land and own it today, the amount of wealth and stability that they could have created for generations to come. I mean, that was a tragic turn of events, because it could have really made the right of a historic wrong, if you will. But ultimately, I think that there's been trillions of dollars that have been amassed on the backs of free labor, right? And so I think you can make two cases. One, you can make a moral case that a percentage of that wealth should be rightly redistributed to the descendants of those who helped create it. Or two, you can make a business case that redistributing wealth would be great for GDP and help accelerate the economy, similar to the logic of a stimulus bill during a pandemic, right? Again, I don't know if reparations will ever come in my lifetime, but if America ever wants to make this right, I would definitely submit my mailing address and be here for it.
Yeah, and Johnny, just really quickly to piggyback off what you said, I read an interesting article that said, I think closing the racial wealth gap will benefit everyone in this country. And I know that I read something that said that closing the racial wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans would actually add between $1 and $1.3 trillion into the US economy. So it should be in everyone's interest to figure out how to create more equity when it comes to wealth, Black Americans and all of that, because it'll benefit everyone within this country.
That is an amazing statistic, like mind-blowing. We have talked a lot about the history and understanding the experiences of enslaved people and how it is impacting us today. And I just want to fast forward really quick for these last few minutes, and let's talk about the phrase is Black and African American. There is a myth that they are the same thing, and that the term minority is an accurate way to classify any and all non-white people. Can we talk about that a little bit, and can we dispel this myth once and for all?
Yeah, I think this is a good myth to dispel, considering I am what they call ADOS, a descendant of enslaved Africans, and Janice is a continental African. She can tell you more about what that means. But I think it is important because Black Americans refer, well, let me just get my thoughts together on this. So
You want me to jump in and then you?
yeah, because I get passionate about this. So
Okay.
no, I got it. So I think it's important to delineate between Black Americans and African Americans, because if there was to be reparations, as we mentioned earlier, any type of support, um, reimbursement, compensation that is made to the descendants of enslaved people, it must be segmented and intentional if it is to be equitable and effective, right? And so I want to say that. However, I think it is very, very, it's a slippery slope to hyper segment, because it can be divisive amongst people of color. I think the Black experience in America is generally shared across the diaspora. I mean, most non-Black people will say, if you dark, you Black. If you have pigment, you Black. You know, you melanated, you Black. And so you get treated and within that kind of frame of reference or that lens. And so I don't like to divide the Black people in any way, but at the same token, if there was to be reparations, obviously the descendants of those people who were here to build that and that are entitled to that should be getting that, and not necessarily dispersed across all Black people in America, because that would defeat the purpose.
Yeah, I agree 100,000%. As someone who, I say this from a non-biased standpoint, I would still fight for reparations for descendants of enslaved people until my last breath. I don't feel like I deserve it at all. My parents immigrated here. I'm not a descendant of enslaved people, so it's not for me. My parents and my descendants didn't build this country. And I do feel like there has to be some sort of recompense for people who are descendants of the individuals who built this country. I think that I love to use the term Black. I think Black is collectively, when you say a Black person, that could be across the diaspora, that could be, but I think when you use African American, it's very specific to descendants of enslaved people. And I think when you're talking about Black people as a whole within this country, and you say African American, obviously it might not include a Haitian American or a Black British person or whomever. But I think to Johnny's point, it's really important to differentiate when it comes to things like reparations, because that should be allotted to. And I know that the question that I always get is, well, how do you assess who is really a descendant of an enslaved person? And I think that that's where it gets a little bit tricky. But I know that there is a committee, HR 40, that has been commissioned by the US government to study reparations and to understand what this would look like, what reparations could be like. So I think that that's something that we have to figure out. But I don't like the term African American. I think it's not really, doesn't really tell you what that means. Like, I could be considered an African American because my parents are African, are from the continent. I am American. So am I an African American? Is a descendant of enslaved people an African American? So I don't think the term African American is all encompassing. I would just prefer the term Black. But I think that, like Johnny said, it's important to differentiate when it comes to things like reparations.
And I would say terminologies evolve, right? Because there was a point in time when African American was the politically correct way to refer or address a person of color or a Black person. And so there are people who come from that school of thought and say, well, why do I have to change? Like, y'all keep changing it up. What is it? But I would say, in terms of being a descendant of an enslaved Africans, we as Black people here don't have a native country that we can go to. So I'm from Petersburg, Virginia. I don't have, I can't go to Ghana and say I have family in Ghana. I can't go to Nigeria and say I have family in Nigeria. I don't have a native land like some African Americans do. They'll have family here in America, and they'll have family in Africa, or any different. Some people come from Asia. They have family in Asia. They have family in the United States. Indian people the same way, Hispanic people the same way. And so we are probably the only group in America that are limited in our ability to communicate and congregate safely in our own space. Because in America, the white society is pretty much the majority of American community, and we don't have a space that we can go where our nationalism is reflected. We don't have that flag that represents us in tandem with America. So I think we definitely lose something in that, and that goes back to the identity piece, and the pride and the culture piece that we struggle to hold on to here in America, that definitely reserves some type of reparation and consideration in this country.
Absolutely. And, you know, in all of these things, the three of us even are all from different elements in the diaspora. And to have a conversation about clarifying how we name a thing, it's not to divide us from one another or create any sort of animosity, but the truth is that we're just not all exactly the same, and we can talk about that without it being a negative or disjointing experience. It's just a factual one. We're going to see if we can slide in these last two myths really fast, and this one is an interesting one. If Black Lives Matter, why is there Black on Black crime?
Well, why is it that no one mentions white on white crime? You know, when a white person kills another white person, do white people not commit crimes against one another? That's the question that I ask. I think Black on Black crime is another propaganda campaign made by the media. It's used to imply that Black people are more violent towards each other than any other race, and that's wrong. I think the numbers are 82% of white people are killed by other white people, and nearly every race is likely to be killed or harmed due to their own proximity amongst those people. So, I mean, to debunk that myth is Black people aren't hurting other Black people because they're Black. If there is a crime amongst Black people, it's not because you're a Black person and I want to harm you. That's something that we can't certainly say about police brutality, because Black Lives Matter was created to bring about awareness to police brutality in local communities. And so we are basically saying in Black Lives Matter that we are experiencing different treatment because we are Black. We are being killed or being shot at more frequently because we are Black. And so saying that Black on Black crime versus Black Lives Matter is just, it's just not comparable.
Yeah, and one thing that I always say is when I get that question is, when a Black person shoots another Black person, they go to jail. You know, when a white person or a person in a position of power shoots or harms a Black person, very often nothing happens. So I think that that's why it's important, and that's essentially exactly as Johnny said, why Black Lives Matter was created, is to bring awareness to this sort of the broken system, where when it's very likely that when someone harms or kills a Black person who is innocent, who is not committing any crimes, that nothing will happen to them for shooting and harming a Black person.
You guys clarified that really quickly. We've talked about some very heavy topics today, and it was all enlightening and informative. And I just want to end this with a little bit of celebration about what we've created. And this myth is that only rap music or hip hop originated from Black people. Dr. Janice, can you clarify that for us?
Yeah, and I was supposed to pull up, I was gonna pull up an article about this, but essentially every form of music has been or was created by Black people. And I think that from rock music to jazz to, country music, interestingly enough, if you look into the origins, it was enslaved people were creating music while they were on the slave ships. And that music sounded very similar to what we now know as country music. And I think that when we think about country music, and I was reading way back about some of the controversy when the rapper / country musician Lil Nas X had a song that, blew up and went viral, and he experienced racism within the country music industry. And I just thought how ironic that was, because country music was started by Black people. A lot of people don't know that. And so virtually every genre of music that we listen to, that we enjoy, was started by Black people, was built by Black people. Rock music is another one where a lot of artists that we probably know, a lot of artists we probably like, rock music artists, have sort of borrowed and appropriated their sound and their style from Black artists who did not get as much credit. One thing I would encourage you to do is look up the history of Elvis Presley and where he got a lot of his music from, because I think that some of the things that you might read may shock you.
Thank you so much for that. In addition to building land, we make music. So there is so much in the rich history of being Black people in America. I do want to jump into these questions, see if we can get through them all before the 6 o'clock mark. First up, Kay asked, what are your thoughts on how we can better acknowledge the diversity within the Black community? As with your experience, Dr. Asare, we share the complexions and experiences as citizens in this society, but our history is vast and rich, and not all Black does not, and all Black does not mean African American Black.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One thing I love, and I was telling Johnny this recently, is that like I love to hop into Clubhouse rooms. Clubhouse is like this new voice-based app. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's available for iPhone users, but I just hop into rooms and I listen to people and I listen to people talking. And I've learned a lot just from being on the app and listening to people's experiences. And for me, like listening and reading, you know, Dr. Joy DeGruy's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. So I think that there has to be an acknowledgement that, exactly as you said, Ariana, just simply recognizing that although we have a shared skin color, our experiences are a little bit different. I don't think there's anything divisive about that. And I think that like when we try to conflate everyone's experiences and say, well, we're all Black, you know, why do we have to delineate and differentiate? I think that that's like sort of demeaning to people's very unique experiences. I don't have an understanding of some of the experiences of my very close friends who are descendants of enslaved people. And that's okay to say our experiences are a little bit different. We have a lot of shared experiences, but there's also differences. And I think that being able to acknowledge that is what's going to really move us forward. Because I'm big with like, you know, a divided house cannot stand. So it's important for us to be unified in our efforts. And I think we all have kind of the same goals as Black people collectively. So I think that acknowledging the differences is not actually divisive and is what's going to help us come together.
Thank you so much for that very succinct answer to something we know we had started touching on, but still a very important question. Next up, John asked, is there a connection between the reparations confusion brought up by Dr. Asare and the seemingly widespread myth, if I may, that one person's benefit comes at another person's detriment, AKA the pie is a fixed size?
Should I take that question? I'm wondering, that makes me think about the concept of money, where we might think that money is finite when in reality there's money being printed as we speak in America and is being created at an abundant rate. They're creating trillions of dollars just by printing it. I don't think that reparations would necessarily take away from someone else. I mean, obviously there's multiple ways to approach how we would compensate or reimburse the descendants of enslaved people. We say, do we go target the descendants of the planter class and say, you need to give X amount of your wealth or your estate to said people? We know that that would probably take hundreds of years of litigation and never actually happen. But I think from a government perspective, or to eliminate, as Dr. Janice mentioned, eliminate some of the burden, the debt burden that those descendants may be experiencing, could be a logical solution. But I think when you put money in the hands of people who can now create a business, who can now send their kid to a college that gives them an education to start a business or get a good job, putting money back in the community only speeds up and accelerates that community and creates more wealth and abundance for all people. in society. I think America is built on being the land of the free, the home of the brave, the liberty and justice for all, right? And so I think the economy here will only benefit from redistributing some of that wealth. And honestly, if you look at the classes, it's not just Black people that are being relegated to second-class citizenship. Really, it's 1% that is getting hella rich, and a lot of people are getting, middle-class people are getting pushed down into now the poverty line. So it's not just a Black problem, it's a societal problem that we all need to make sure that we're getting the wealth and opportunities that we need to make this a more fair and equitable society.
Yeah, and I think thinking about it from the perspective of the fact that helping the most marginalized folks will help everyone, I think brings it back to or helps people understand that it's not just about, I know it's especially in an individualistic culture, like the US and like some of the countries where some of the folks are calling in from, I know it's hard to conceptualize that. And it's kind of like, well, why should I have to pay extra taxes to fix something that I didn't do? But I think when you think about it more holistically, you realize that closing something like the wealth gap will benefit, the racial wealth gap will benefit everyone in this country. And for me, the way I think about it is, even going back to the reparations point, I would be willing as a professor to sacrifice $50, $100, $200 out of each of my paychecks to go toward a fund that would support the descendants of enslaved people. And, you know, for some people, $50, $100, $200 out of their paycheck for every faculty member, it's not, you know, it's not the end of the world. So I think that there are ways. I just think we have to be imaginative of what reparations could look like. I think some of us, we don't have the imagination to really think about it, but I think that there's so many ways that we could sort of conceptualize it.
Yeah, and I think you've made that abundantly clear during this conversation. Like, just even the idea of tuition is something I hadn't thought of, because most of these colleges were built by slaves, and that's a resource that they already have. So I think this is definitely a conversation we should continue having and keep questioning the system. Our next question, Joyce asked, what are your thoughts about the pushback on the 1619 project?
I don't know if I'm familiar with the pushback, or I didn't know that there was pushback on it. So maybe that's a Johnny question, if you're familiar with the pushback, Johnny. I didn't know that there was pushback. I enjoyed listening to the 1619. I listened to the podcast. I enjoyed it. I didn't know that there was pushback. So
You want to shed more light about what the 1619 project is, and for those who may don't know?
Yeah, so it was put on, I believe, by the New York Times, where I listened to the podcast, and it's a series of episodes that sort of outlines the experiences of descendants of enslaved people. It's kind of told in the voice of, it's kind of like a storytelling. So storytelling, kind of getting into the voice of what it was like to be an enslaved person, and just the experiences, and also kind of scattered with like commentary about like the experiences of enslaved people. So it's really informative. It's interesting. I know it's available on podcasts. I know in New York City, you could get it as like a special issue of the New York Times or something like that. But as far as I know, I haven't heard about any pushback or any backlash. So I would love to hear more. And after this, I'll probably just go and Google it.
Ditto.
Yeah, I didn't hear any pushback on it either. And I don't know what you really could push back on about someone's story, but everyone always finds a way.
Yeah.
All right. So this is going to be our last question for the evening. Say asks, oh, it's a long one. What's the quick steps to close this prosperity gap in the short and long term? Johnny, I think this is a question for you, and I don't know if there are quick steps per se, but let's see.
Yeah, it's not a quick fix, and there's no one solution, panacea type of cure. But I think the first step, and we talk about this in my organization at ShineHard, we have an 8-step methodology. I won't bore you through all 8 steps, but I can tell you some of the key modules that we talk about is history and heritage. I think the first thing is finding our genealogy. and building out our family tree so that we have something that we can pass down. Because in other cultures, there's a book that says, hey, here is your great great grandfather. Here's what he did. Here's who he was. And we can find identity in that in the common day. And you pass that down as an heirloom to the next generation. Number two, I think it's just simple financial wellness. So we have the mindset of poverty. If you have the mindset of poverty, that is going to disrupt and affect all of the decisions you make with your paycheck, with the money that you do have. So learning how to set financial goals, how to budget, how to invest, how the economy works, how the capitalistic society works, those are the things that we need to start learning more about and getting involved so we can become a part of the game and beat the system. And then lastly, I would just say entrepreneurship is a major key. If you don't come from a wealthy family must come from you. So how can you work your 9 to 5 and create a side hustle where you can create additional streams of income to accelerate wealth and net worth for your family? And most importantly, set up a 529 for your kid. Make sure you're getting life insurance. Make sure you're creating a trust and a power of attorney. If anything does happen to you, you've worked so hard to create this net worth and this estate. Who does it go to and how should it be used? Talking to your kids about money and what that means, it's everything. So you can't necessarily make a quick fix, but everything starts with you and your family, and you can change the wealth gap with that.
Thank you guys so much for all of the information and the resources that you've shared over the course of this conversation. And thank you all for joining us today. Dr. Johnny, geez. Dr.
I know, Jay's.
I made it this far. Dr. Janice and Johnny, thank you for your time and your insight. Before we go, I'd like to share 2 slides. And so Meetup is all about connecting with one another. Meet with other people who share your passion for exploring history like we have today. Start your own group on Meetup and save 50% on your first subscription payment. Go to meetupsavings.com. Additionally, we have a brand new podcast with our CEO, David Siegel. You can subscribe now at meetuppodcast.com. You can actually pull out your phone right now, hold it up to your screen and scan this QR code right in front of you, and it'll take you straight to meetuppodcast.com. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good evening.
Did we get a chance to plug in our names, information, how people can find us?
The floor is yours, guys. Please, please.
Sure. Really quick, if you guys want to connect and talk more about the racial wealth gap or anything that we touched on today, myths, misconceptions, you guys can catch me on LinkedIn at Johnny Bailey or on Instagram at @1JohnnyBailey. If you're interested in supporting the ShineHard family, you can visit us at ShineHardFamily.org, ShineHardFamily.org/donate if you want to actually contribute and take action towards closing the wealth gap. And I would love to talk more about any of the things we had today. So I'll throw it to Janice.
Thank you. So if any of you are interested in talking more about, I love talking about reparations, even though, I wouldn't be getting any, but like conceptualizing what it would look like, you could find me. I'm always on LinkedIn, Janice Gassam Asare, or Instagram, Janice J Nice. Or you could just Google my name and my articles and things will pop up. And if you're interested in finding out how I can facilitate a conversation like this in your workplace, all of my information is on my website, drjanisgassam.com.
There will be a follow-up email to this event as well as a blog post with the recording. So if you weren't able to copy all of that down, you'll definitely be able to connect with Dr. Janice and Johnny. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thanks everyone.
Peace.